Welcome to Teaching Truth. Judge John Deed is one of my favourite television dramas. Sir John Deed, a High Court judge, actively seeks justice in the cases which come before him. He's described as a judge who speaks out against all the petty rules and bureaucracy that frustrates us all, but that most of us don't speak out against. And because of Judge John Deed's unorthodox actions, Judge Deed is often hampered in the drama in his pursuit of justice by several more traditionally minded characters and advocates. Judge John Deed. Well, I wonder how Judge John Deed would have handled the case of Paul had it come before his court. And for all that Judge John Deed was and is in the drama, I don't think he would have been as ruthless and as unscrupulous as Judge Felix was. Judge Felix, of whom we read in Acts 24, and Judge Felix before whom Paul was to appear. By way of background, Felix was the Roman governor of Judea for 5 years and the successor to Pontius Pilate. He became a favourite buddy of Claudius Caesar, the emperor of Rome. And Felix was given the governorship of Judea. However, he was far from a good governor. He was ruthless, he was vile, he was greedy, and totally unrestrained in his sexual behaviour. Now, it's interesting and not insignificant that in Latin the word Felix means pleasure. Felix slaughtered any and all who were a threat to his rule because he was an insecure tyrant. He had been married 3 times to 3 different princesses. He would rub out and deal with anyone harshly who got in the way of his political ambitions. And it's before such a wicked, ruthless, vile, and unscrupulous judge that the Apostle Paul was to appear, Judge Felix. The first court appearance before Judge Felix took place 5 days after Paul arrived in Caesarea. The high priest Ananias and a lawyer, an advocate, a QC as it were of the day, came from Jerusalem to make their accusations before Felix. But after hearing both sides of the story, Felix was not convinced of the accusations. He dismissed Ananias and the other accusers and said that he would decide the case when the original commander came from Jerusalem to the court in Caesarea. Now, this seems to be a move, I think, by Felix to stall the proceedings. And although he allowed Paul some freedom and let his friends visit him, the reality is that this vile and unscrupulous governor and judge kept Paul remanded in custody for 2 years. For 2 years, hoping in vain that Paul would give him a bribe to secure his freedom. But Paul was not playing the Felix game. Paul talked about Jesus often. And although Felix and by his then 3rd wife Drusilla often called Paul out of prison just to hear him talk about his faith in Jesus, they never, as far as we know, made a commitment and became followers of Jesus themselves. Well, Tertullus was certainly an advocate, a QC, or should I say KC, that flattered Felix. Acts 24 verses 2 and 3. Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. Such flattery and such lies. And Felix, in the two senses of the word, played to the court. Well, the accusations that were set forth in relation to Paul appearing before Felix were set forth by Tertullus, KC. There was the charge of political sedition, that of Paul being a revolutionary, a troublemaker who stirred up riots throughout all the empire. And the Romans in those days, under no circumstances, would tolerate civil disorder. They often called Paul the pest. There was also the charge that was brought by Tertullus, this advocate, of religious heresy, that of Paul being a radical ringleader of a religious sect or heresy. And there was also the charge of sacrilegious profaning of the temple, that Paul had tried to bring a Gentile into the temple to profane it. And that caught the ear of the Romans because they knew the temple was sacred to the Jews, and that any uprising about the temple could inflame the whole nation of Israel and cause a revolution. So this advocate Tertullus, KC, had brought these accusations before this unscrupulous judge Felix. Well, what did Felix do? Acts 24:22, he deferred the case because it became obvious even to Felix that Paul was innocent. And there is no question that Paul should have been released immediately. However, Felix adjourned the court, postponing the decision on Paul, and Paul therefore stayed a prisoner. Why was that? Well, many think that Felix, in his own heart, was a weak man and kept Paul in prison to placate the Jews, because Felix was more interested in public opinion than in principle. What Felix should have said is, case dismissed. We don't know why Felix made that decision, but he did. And so Paul was put under house arrest when he was totally innocent. He would stay under house arrest for 2 more years. 2 years, when he spoke with Felix and his wife from time to time. Yes, it's true that Paul got a raw deal. His case should have been dismissed, and Judge John Deed would most probably have dismissed his case. However, is it not part of God's plan that God wanted Paul to witness to Felix and Drusilla, his wife, for these 2 years? And we may never know, and probably don't know, the outcome of Paul's witnessing to them. But in God's economy, those 2 years of being under house arrest, when technically he should have been free, those 2 years were not wasted years, because for Paul there was a purpose for Paul to witness to Felix and Drusilla. God even worked through the most unlikely advocate, Tertullus, who brought the false accusations against Paul. God was in absolute control. God allowed Paul to have an input and an influence into the life of Felix. Join me tomorrow in Teaching Truth as we look at Paul's trial, not before Felix, but before Festus.